All right, Cam, we're a few days away from getting out of lockdown.
Like an animal. Because of this lockdown, I have to sit here like an animal. Serenity now, serenity now.
What is that?
Doctor gave me a relaxation cassette when my blood pressure gets too high. The man on the tape tells me to say, serenity now.
Are you supposed to yell it?
The man on the tape wasn't specific.
Case numbers aren't looking good. It looks like we might be in lockdown indefinitely.
Serenity now.
Welcome to It's About Nothing. Today, the podcast is about lockdowns and the little strategies you can do to make yourself feel better. All right, well, another little Seinfeld script, this pretty famous one, Serenity Now. I think everyone's at least seen the meme.
Yeah, one of my favorites.
It is. It's a great one, isn't it? I always, I think that for those who watch the show, it's what's his name, Frank Costanza, who was Jerry Stiller. Yeah, he's
yes.
like people always said, and I always thought as well that when they finished Seinfeld, having a spin-off series with the Costanzas would have been the most obvious show. Like, and I'm not sure we discussed this, but even having one set in like Florida with Jerry's parents and George's parents.
Boca Vista.
Yeah,
I would love that. Yeah, and maybe you could even have Kramer in there because at one point he was talking about retiring to Florida, or you could at least have some guest appearances from Kramer. I would have liked that. I never really watched the show in a big way, but didn't they try and do that with Jerry Stiller in was King? Is it King of Queens? Like, was his character in that where he plays a father or father-in-law living with like grown-up kids? Was he a very different character in that? Do you know? He seemed to be a cantankerous old man. But
I think so, and it also goes to show, doesn't it, that the cast in Seinfeld was really good, but really it was the script.
Yeah.
Everything was done really well, because you see that with lots of sitcoms. Like, you see these like sitcom stars go off to do other things, and you kind of like, cringe a bit and go, oh, they're not as good as they were in the other one. And then you realize, well, obviously not, because it's not just them that made the show. It was obviously the writing and the people directing it and producing it. And
yeah. And there's that sort of the thing with success. Like I remember not that long before COVID, actually, I saw Jason Alexander when he was out here on tour, and I think you might have seen him too.
Yes.
Separately, and he talked about the great success of Seinfeld, but then like people only kind of know him for that, and he's a very talented theater actor and singer, a musical actor, and he's sort of known for all this other stuff, but he still mostly gets George.
He does.
But he's obviously made a lot of money out of that as well. So.
Yeah, look, I liked his kind of one-man show thing, but I must admit, I felt like that was a bit of a cliche as well. Like, I was hoping that he would rise above, because given what a great actor he is and great comedian, that he would rise above the classic sort of cliche of the actor who gets typecast and gets annoyed by people coming up to him, because it's very common, isn't it? It's like
I get what you're saying, but I think it was real. Like, that's just how he genuinely felt, and it was probably pretty burning for him. But the funniest thing about that show for me, I saw it in Canberra, and he had a Q&A session, and he could really be pretty harsh with the audience, but in quite a funny way. And the Q&A session was quite good and quite funny, and he got to the end of it and he told this lady that her question was the last one, and he made some joke about it being under pressure, and she asked a question like, who was your favorite actor to work with in the ensemble, or what was the ensemble experience like? And he just stopped and he said, my God, you've just asked the lamest question. Like, all this, everyone was like waiting for you to ask this real zinger of a question to take it out on a high, and you've really let it down. Everybody laughed along and stuff like that. And he sort of answered the question, and I just assumed that it was a really light moment. And then I went home, and later that night I was sort of like trolling through Twitter, and I knew he was on Twitter and he's pretty active. And the woman in the audience had actually tweeted him and said how mortified she was. She was terribly upset. It was a few hours later.
Oh,
She was still
no.
really distraught.
That's
And like she hadn't seen any of the humor in the situation at all. And he'd actually gone back to her and he didn't apologize at first. I think he said, "Look, this is what I do," straight out. Like,
mm.
it wasn't directed at you. It was sort of just part of the experience. But it was like she didn't see any of the humor in it, and that itself became really funny because you'd think that if she was familiar with Jason Alexander or this the Seinfeld brand of comedy that
Mm.
she'd sort of see the quirks in it, but she didn't, unfortunately. So
Yeah, I think there was because he was a bit terse with some of the audience members at ours as well. Like, and fair enough, there was actually an annoying question right at the start where he said he didn't want to have Seinfeld questions at the start. He said
yeah, he did that with us too. Yeah.
yeah, and then the very
Yeah.
first person who asked a question, of course, it was a Seinfeld one, and he was just like, "Come on, guys!" And I was kind of like, I can kind of understand why he was irritated, but I think you do get to a point where it's like, it's almost like, I think in some ways he almost didn't needed to not take it as seriously as well, like almost,
Yeah.
go, all right, guys, I'm going to answer this one, but the next one will be, let's talk about Pretty Woman or and some
Well,
one of the
yeah.
other ones.
Did he tell you in the show you saw? Did he tell you the story of the making of Pretty Woman?
Oh, he did, but I can't remember. Was it something to do with that they didn't want him originally in that?
Well, yeah, but I don't know if he told it differently for us, but it was one of my favorite parts of the show. Like he kind of told it as they thought they were making a completely different movie. So basically, all the actors in that thought they were making a really dark movie,
Oh,
like
right.
a much grittier movie that was sort of about a man who picks up a prostitute in West Hollywood, and but it had different scenes in it that were cut, like it had some violent scenes and just had a whole different gist to it. But the way they shot the movie was kind of very disjointed with all those different scenes. And then when they actually, I think it wasn't until they went to the premiere and saw the edit, and it was like a completely different movie, at least the way he told it. So they kind of didn't realize they were making a comedy, which it sounds
Mm.
odd in the telling of it, but it was
Oh, I think I remember now. Yeah, the director basically went on a covert mission to almost remake the movie as they were filming it, didn't he? Like he was always
Yeah, I think
pushing.
the original intention was it to be quite a different movie, and I mean, it's a Cinderella story, obviously set
Mhm.
in a different context. So, and I'm a big fan of that movie because I think it kind of like the prototype for basically every rom com that followed it in the '90s. Like
True.
it's that and maybe the sort of Four Weddings and a Funeral, which is I don't know if it's a British production per se, but it's set in the UK. But they were kind of prototypes in the early '90s for a lot of movies that followed. Yeah,
Yeah, no, you're right. I think at the end of Pretty Woman, I think she was supposed to die in the original script.
yeah, yeah. It's really different. Yeah,
That's about as dark as
yeah.
it gets, isn't it?
Which part of me would I don't know if they actually shot all those extra scenes, but I'd be fascinated to see like that
Mm,
other director's cut, so to speak.
mm.
Yeah,
Now, onto our topic then. So we picked that Serenity now, obviously, because in fact, it's almost like apathy now, or something else, isn't it? Because
yeah,
in Australia, we've been well, in Victoria, we've been locked down for at least 6 months of the last 18 months. So about a
yeah,
third of the time we've been in lockdown. So we're in lockdown right now. And I'm always very curious about watching the news from other countries like the UK and the US because I like hearing them talk about what's happening in Australia and New Zealand because just to see and they're not completely across it because they're more concerned with their own sort of situation, which is understandable. But
yeah,
they often say, like in some cases, they'll kind of go, "Oh, it's terrible what's happening in Australia. They're really locking them down. They won't let them leave their house." And then in other situations, they'll say, "Wow, Australia really got it under control. They adopted a different strategy to us." And it's going to be this ongoing discussion, isn't it, around these strategies and which
yeah.
ones ultimately are the best ones. And we won't know for probably many years to come exactly what the final outcome is going to be.
Well, that's true, and it changes. So I think like this time last year, our strategy looked really good in a lot of ways because there was absolute carnage around the world in other countries, and we're doing quite well in terms of people actually dying, getting seriously sick. But now that vaccines a real proposition, and a lot of the countries in the northern hemisphere have got very high levels of vaccine, they're opening up, and I think we're at about 11 or 12% fully vaccinated, and it's in the 20s for first dose. But we're a long way behind, so that's part of the reason we find ourselves in these sort of continual lockdowns at the moment. Australia's two biggest cities are in lockdown, obviously, so that's a huge chunk of the population. So yeah, I think it's definitely going to be a big topic, at least for the next 6 to 12 months, until we sort of
Mm.
get people fully vaccinated and then start opening up from there.
Yeah, I think what this has revealed to me anyway is that these strategies are just not really there. They're not really there. Like we say, there was a strategy, but I'm not ever sure if there really ever was
Oh
because
yeah, what does strategy imply? Like
yeah,
I have a master's in strategic studies, but that's like military studies. But the idea of strategy in a military sense is kind of like the alignment of means and ends, like setting yourself an objective and
mm,
going after it. But strategy implies that you've got a plan, right? That you're working proactively, whereas what we see, I think, is really more reactive
yeah, it is.
policy and policy settings. So there's been attempts to set strategy, particularly at the national level. Like even a week or two ago, the Prime Minister sort of like got national cabinet together and is setting this plan. But then you see straight away it sort of gets away from them because different states have different experiences, and they'll go their own way. So it's not really a strategy in my view.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, that's a good question, maybe for you as well. Is that uh, is it still a strategy if you change? I guess is change your tactics or you change your strategy. Like for example, I'll give you an example. Actually, in New South Wales, as we know, there was. It seemed like the strategy that was followed there was in line with almost the original strategy that Australia deployed, which was just to suppress
Yeah,
and then when things sort of bubble to the surface, you do heavy contact tracing, but you allow things to remain open. And
yeah,
that seemed to, after that initial lockdown, that seemed to play out up until just what a few weeks ago or a month ago, when the case number started to go up again. And it seemed to me that all of a sudden, because the strategy either wasn't working this time or there was a change of heart because of the case numbers, that the plan
yeah.
changed to we've got to get this down to elimination.
Yeah, well, I think you've identified it right there. Part of the contradiction with strategy here is that what first of all, to have a strategy, you've got to have an alignment on what the objective is,
Hmm.
and frankly, there isn't that. So, like, I think the federal government has talked about suppression, but then and some of the states have as well, but then other states are clearly talking about zero, like
Hmm.
it has to be zero, and then others have sort of used language in the middle, but they really mean zero, I think, and they're two quite different things. So you're talking about this idea of like elimination or living with the virus, and what does that mean? And like personally, I think living with the virus in the long run means high levels of vaccination and society sort of opening up. I can't really see
Mm.
any other way of doing it, but there's not really agreement across the board
Mm.
on all that at the moment.
Yeah, I think you nailed it actually. That the idea, it's really what is the ultimate objective? What is the outcome we're trying to get to? Uh,
Yeah,
because I think so. Like when this first started, I must admit I'm a terrible fence sitter. I think on this whole issue because I can see I can see the dilemma everyone's dealing with because I feel like I can understand the why lockdowns are really important, but also I can understand why they're also extremely damaging and crippling.
yeah, yeah.
So it's such a hard situation. But I guess when we first started, my sort of thought was there's no way we're ever going to get a vaccine in the next 12 months. I
Mhm.
really didn't think so because we'd never been able to do that before.
Mm.
And it just seemed like it was a nice thing that we dangled in front of ourselves, but we
Yeah,
did it. It was incredible that it was done. But given that there wasn't going to be a vaccine, the question I always had in the back of my mind was Oh no, it wasn't just in the back of my mind. I discussed it. I said, look, if there's no vaccine, what is the actual plan? Because sure, we certainly can't just stay in lockdown forever either. We've
Yeah.
got to have some sort of plan for living with it. And fortunately, that did come along. So then the strategy I felt could actually change, like in terms of you could look at it and go, well, we have this option we didn't have before. So now we can actually follow this path forward, which is we can stay, we can suppress as really hard suppression until we get everyone vaccinated.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have come to that now, haven't they? They've kind of gone, well, there's actually light at the end of the tunnel if we stay the course and don't let things get out of control. We just got to get everyone vaccinated now.
Oh, absolutely. Like our position now is so much better than it was 12 months ago. Like, say, Melbourne was going into a very deep
Mhm.
lockdown then, and vaccine, I think by that point, there were already trials going on. But I like you and most people, thought, well, that's probably a few years off, and it might take 18 months just to get them licensed and all that sort of stuff. And then that happened very quickly. And for all the logistical problems with rollout, like I think there is a lot more hope now, which
Mhm.
is fantastic. And sometimes we probably lose sight of that, but there's also a lot of exhaustion.
Mhm.
And like I've mentioned on this podcast before, I've been living in Canberra, and so I feel like this is our first real lockdown. So I, in some ways, probably have less exhaustion than other people, and I probably observe the few people I interact with at the moment
Yeah.
around here. Yeah, I can see a lot of apathy, and whereas maybe a year ago people were tuned into the news in a big way, even a couple of conversations I've had, people aren't paying as much attention to it, and that's maybe that'll feed into what we're talking about with lockdown strategies, coping strategies. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Like I consume a lot of news normally, but I certainly don't sit there and watch the 2 hour daily press conference and that sort of thing. But yeah, I probably don't have time, but I don't think it's a good use of time anyway.
Yeah, I think, and it depends on your situation, because I reckon there's a sense of desperation when your business relies on a foot traffic coming through, like
Definitely.
restaurants.
Yeah.
Like every day, basically, you feel the pain, and I think a lot of people are frustrated that with, I guess the people, the decision makers who potentially have the luxury of being able to work from home and just hop on Zoom calls. And for
Yeah.
them,
Yeah.
yeah, it's an inconvenience to be
Yeah,
locked
it's so true. If your income is not impacted, your work security is not impacted
down.
by lockdowns, you have a different experience of it. No doubt about that. Like you might still have a lot of the dilemmas around homeschooling and feeling isolated and that sort of thing. But I think this came up in a number of conversations we had in going back into last year about lockdowns and the COVID experience and how it really divides people in a way. Like we talked about everybody being in it together, but I remember leading up to last Christmas having conversations with some guests we had on about how conversations around the Christmas dinner table would sort of show what a different experience people had. Because if you have one member of the family who's like owned a small business and that business has been, shut down, if not wiped out by multiple lockdowns, they've got a very different experience to somebody who's in secure employment, possibly in the public sector in a loose way, maybe not. And I think people's attitudes are definitely shaped by that.
Yeah, and here are what I would call the elephant in the room questions now, which no one seems to want to answer. I think the first one is, if you get vaccinated, um, why do you have to be locked down? Like
Yeah, yeah,
that's the first one. I know that
yeah,
maybe they'll say, oh, you can still transmit the virus, but I think a lot of people sort of are going, they're probably thinking, what's the benefit of rushing out to get vaccinated? Because it looks like I'm stuck in the same situation, even if I do. And I think as
yeah,
a great carrot for the whole thing would be, if you get vaccinated, if you really want people to get out there and to do it, then say to them, you won't have to live under the same restrictions as you've been living under.
yeah. So I find that one really interesting because we've had much less experience in Australia, thankfully, of death and like mass hospitalizations. And so in the US and the UK, Europe, for example, like a big vaccine selling point is surely like if you take this thing, you won't die.
Mhm.
And if you've lived in a country where you've literally seen people die around you, you might have family members, friends who've died or become very sick. That's going to be much more real to you than here, where we haven't had that experience as much. So people maybe here people have higher expectations of what vaccines should be able to do for them. I don't know, but I like I don't know if you saw the French had an ad campaign for vaccine, which was sort of like people get the shot and then it shows all these things opening up.
Yeah,
So
a very
you get
positive
the vaccine.
campaign. Yeah.
Yeah, restaurant opens up, the theater's full of people. And I seriously thought we should just have bought that one off them and maybe dubbed it or something like this.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'm a big fan of, like, I think if you want to, I'd much rather motivate people with the,
Yeah,
like, the rewards rather than the fear campaign approach with showing people
yeah,
on respirators, which I think is just like kids see those things. It's horrible to try and motivate people by saying you will die. I think it's a lazy way of motivating people.
yeah. I find that interesting. I know we had a conversation last week, I think, about
Mm.
there was an ad that was on TV. It was pretty traumatic, of a young woman on a respirator in a hospital, and that was pretty controversial. I haven't seen that ad. Like, I don't
Neither
watch
have I.
the
Yeah,
free to air TV, but I've got a feeling that it may have been pulled, or it's
yeah,
certainly been
I
put in
didn't
really
see it
low
either.
circulation. Yeah,
Everyone saw the image, and to your point last week, it was that the person they had in the ad wasn't actually allowed to get the vaccine yet. So
for
it
me
was
that was the biggest problem.
kind of
So
silly.
like I'm maybe a little less critical than you are about using fear, but I think the stick has to be followed by a carrot, so to speak. Like, you can't sort of like beat people up for not getting a vaccine if they're not actually eligible for a vaccine. Like, to me, that's an absurdity.
Yeah. So the second elephant in the room was, does the vaccine actually stop transmission? Uh, and again, that might be something they can't answer yet. But again, it was kind of a weird one where I know a lot of people are saying, well, if you get it, you can still get it, but you won't get as sick, right?
Yeah, yeah,
But I'm curious about, surely it must stop the spread to some extent. Like, what kind of, to what extent? Because otherwise, I feel like what's happening at the moment is that they're kind of going, well, the vaccine, they're kind of downplaying how effective it is in a way, and it's making people feel less confident that it's actually going to solve anything, which is a problem, I think, as well. So
yeah,
if you feel like it's not going to, if they keep saying you've been fully vaccinated, but you can still spread the virus, it's kind of sending the message that, yeah, it's not really, we're not going to get out of this. Which,
yeah. My sense of it is, and I'm a little bit hesitant in case I say something in the public domain that's sort of not scientifically correct. But my sense is that from the trials, they have a pretty good idea about I guess, the clinical efficiency of the vaccine in preventing sort of death and serious illness, but they've got a much less of an idea about its ability to stop the spread. And maybe that's unavoidable. Maybe they just literally need more time to observe how that works. But I'm a little confused myself. I've heard kind of mixed things about that. I've heard people say almost as that has no effect whatsoever on the spread, and other people say, "Oh, we know that Pfizer has like a certain
yeah,
range of effect on the spread." Yeah,
yeah,
not just Pfizer, others too. Yeah,
yeah. And the other one being, and of course, you and I are both fully vaccinated, so we're not questioning the efficacy. I think
definitely. Yeah, yeah.
we
And
both.
I encourage anyone who's eligible to get vaccinated.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that it's the fastest way out of this situation, and it's the lesser of two evils. It's we know that if you do, I think the worst situation. You or I are probably young enough that if we got COVID, we probably wouldn't get very sick. But I think to your point, it's more the worry that you pass it on to someone who does, and then you sort of have regret that happened.
Yeah,
And that's why I'm kind of keen to understand, does it actually stop transmission, because or at least reduce it to some extent, because then it gives you a bit more confidence to
yeah. I
not
mean,
worry.
I really want to be able to travel again too. Like, I kind of made a joke on social media when I got it that my main motivation was so I could go back to the Why Not bar at Kantiang Bay in Thailand, which is like my favorite beach bar in the world. And I know that's still quite a way off, but actually, Krabi province in Thailand is about to start a trial with Phuket's already done it, but people who've been vaccinated will be able to come in and have a very short quarantine period and then go on holiday. So
Mhm.
theoretically, at that end of it, it's getting closer. But at this end of it, the Australian government won't let me leave the country at the moment, and it would seem to be a pretty reckless thing to do when there's a lot of Aussies overseas like still struggling just to get home. For me, obviously, to go on a holiday, but I mean, maybe this is a coping strategy as well. This is the idea of kind of hope, having a light at the end of the tunnel. Like, even if traveling's a long way away, even if I have to have a booster before I actually do it, I kind of felt I took back a little bit of control by having vaccine.
Yeah, no, yeah, I know what you mean. You feel like, well, and if we get the percentages up enough, then it'll probably lead more confidence to not lock down as again. Which is that I think this is the third elephant in the room, which is how confident are we we'll ever get the vaccination rates up? Because really, what we're dealing with is number one, some people are concerned about having it because they're concerned about long term effects. There's a group of anti-vax type people who never have it anyway, which we
Yeah,
won't get through. And
yeah,
then there's the third one being that there's a lot of people who are not really anti or worried. They just uh, don't really have a strong opinion either way. So they're not going to rush out to get it unless they're highly motivated to do it.
yeah, yeah,
That's going to be a huge percentage. Like, and if you need to have, let's say, 80% of people vaccinated to feel confident, it's quite possible that this thing could sort of hang around at sort of 40%, 50% for years to come. And
yeah.
yeah, and then we're sort of caught in this middle ground again where we're like, do we have to have these constant lockdowns because the population are allowing us?
Yeah. I'm more hopeful. If you look at Australia's history of sort of immunisation uptake, it's pretty high. So we have pretty high rates of getting the flu jab and people getting their inoculations and things like that. We like the anti-vaxxer movement here has always been a fringe movement. It's probably grown a bit in recent years, even before COVID, for various reasons. But I think they've got much more of a problem in the US where there's because like politically, almost philosophically, there's like a big emphasis on personal freedom.
Mm.
There's less emphasis on sort of collective responsibility and the collective good. And I think ultimately here, I think most people will get it because they'll see that as the only pathway to sort of going back to any kind of normal life. But there will be pockets,
Mm.
and there may be sort of large groups that don't get it, and that could be a problem because I think you need. This is another question too, like how high does it need to be? So
Right. Yeah.
I've heard some commentators talk about it being as low as like 70%, sometimes even in the 60s, 70%. Others sort of say it has to be 90 plus. And that's a huge difference in what you're asking there. So I could see an uptake in the 70s fairly easily, but if it has to be 90 plus, that could be really tricky.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right, and I think a target would be really helpful. I think
Mm.
I think the government's been careful about not
Yeah,
saying
they don't want to set a target.
I don't want
It's
to
like,
set a target. I know, and
yeah.
it's really frustrating because, and I understand because we do it in our own lives. Because let's face it, we if we want to like get in shape or something, we don't like a lot of people will avoid looking at the scales and things like that because if you set a target, you almost like make yourself accountable.
Well,
And
yeah, actually, something interesting happened yesterday or the day before. I think this is something we've touched on in previous podcasts. Is the Prime Minister apologized? So
yeah,
we've
that was
talked about leaders like admitting they were wrong and apologizing and being able to do that, and we saw an interesting example of that in the last few days. So the PM had been on a number of FM radio slots, and
mm,
from my time in politics, I know that they'll often do those kind of slots because they tend to be soft interviews. They tend to maximize exposure, and they tend to be pretty positive and not
right.
probing. But something really interesting happened the other day. The PM did one. I think it was on Kiss FM in Sydney. I forget who the announcer was, but he just kept sort of grilling the PM and saying, "Why won't you say sorry? Will you say sorry?" And I just got the impression that the Prime Minister was not expecting to find himself, in that territory on FM radio. It was kind of that's why he doesn't do an interview with Lee Sales all that often.
Yeah,
And then within about 24 hours, he came out and did use the sorry word, and it was a pretty clever pivot from his office because I think they realized that there was a game starting up. You'd already seen it subsequently with a couple of ministers going on and
Mm.
doing media appearances. Very direct question: will you say sorry? How do you feel
Right.
about this
Okay.
personally? And it just would not have gone away.
Yep.
So and very often they make the mistake of ignoring it or trying to ignore it, and it'll play out for days, if not weeks, of just like stonewalling it, and it gets worse and
Mm.
worse and worse. But in this case, they kind of like cauterized it fairly quickly, and he said sorry. So, Matt, we'll see how that plays out in terms of people's attitudes.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I did hear that, and I actually thought, oh, that good. At least that's something because, like, I think I know everybody's frustrated in Australia with the vaccine rollout, and as am I. But because I sort of think we've had all this time, it's everyone's like all this time in lockdown. That's the one thing we needed to get right on the other end.
Yeah,
But it is as much as that is the case. There are certainly factors that are just so hard to control with these things, and it was the fact that all these other countries, Europe in particular, that have thousands and thousands of people were dying, and they had an obvious immediate need for more vaccine, and so did America. And so there was in many ways, Australia was like sitting here with hardly any deaths,
yeah,
hardly any cases.
yeah. There was a fairly brief period early in the year where I remember a number of people saying, well, maybe we shouldn't be rolling out vaccine too quickly here because they clearly need it more than we do
Yeah.
on the other side of the world, and that changed pretty quickly. But I think there's a very relative thing here, almost like keeping up with the Joneses. So last year we felt pretty good about where we were because we looked at the rest of the world and saw how badly they were doing.
Yes.
And now we look at the rest of the world and see how well they're doing. And like the UK is an interesting example, I guess, as is the US, because they really messed up the initial response to the virus, but they've done really well subsequently in rolling out vaccination. So we've almost had the opposite experience. So people know that vaccine can be rolled out on a national scale relatively quickly, and they're asking why we can't do it.
Do you know one of the other, when you was talking about this prime minister saying sorry, I was kind of you were sort of saying they cauterized it. I was sort of wondering if that actually has done that because I'm just thinking of a similar situation, but it's probably the character of Donald Trump's probably a bit of an outlier. But there
Yeah,
were certainly situations with Trump where people would like the media would attack him on a particular issue, and he would have a response, and then he'd have an interview, and they'd say, "How come you've never responded to this?" And he'd say, "Well, I actually did, and let me say it again." And then they keep going on about it again, and I think it was in relation to, I think it could have been, it was something to do with the white. Oh, that's right. The what do they call them? White supremacist type groups.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah,
do you support them? And he's come out. He came out many times saying, "I don't. I completely condone. I don't condone them at all that kind of stuff." And he kept having these interviews where people would say, "How come you don't denounce white supremacists?" And he'd say, "Well, I do. I've said it so many times. How many times?" And I
yeah,
just wonder if the same thing would happen with the prime minister here, where he said sorry, but I can just imagine a week from now people saying, "How come you've never apologized for
yeah,
this?"
yeah. No, you're right. Like that, there's still a risk of that happening, and like the sort of pivot that they've played, there's no
Mm.
guarantee of success. And the reason they don't like using the S word, and they rarely do, is because they've given Labor a soundbite right there. So I'll guarantee you at the next election, there'll be an ad featuring Scott Morrison saying sorry, not as a sort of like
Yeah.
great leader taking responsibility way, but as in a very sort of pathetic
Mm.
Johnny come lately kind of way. And it'll be something like, this guy's sorry's not good enough,
Mhm.
vote one elbow to get this thing right. So
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I think, yeah, we'll hold you to that now. Let's see what happens.
We'll see. Yeah, and I'm giving free advice to ALP, spin doctors.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny, isn't it? Like you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? With
Yeah.
apologies, it's like
Oh,
apologies.
definitely, definitely. Yeah.
And that's why they're so careful not to do it. Of course, I don't know if it's comparable at all, but I know everyone was saying in Victoria with the lockdown last year, which went on for months, or it felt like it did anyway. Uh, a lot of people were doing the same thing to Daniel Andrews, saying they haven't taken responsibility and haven't acknowledged or apologised, and some people would say that, because I didn't hear the prime minister's apology, but some people were saying that, well, the apology wasn't. He actually did apologize, but it wasn't the sort of apology that sounds like one. If that makes
Yeah,
sense, it was kind
yeah,
of like, I know, not necessarily apology, but it was almost like when you say, well, of course I'm responsible. If I'm ultimately responsible for all of this,
yeah.
it kind of sounds like you have taken responsibility, but it's such a global statement.
That's yeah. That so he I think from my memory he'd take a sort of very high level, broad overview like responsibility buck stops with me thing, which is very
Mm,
effective communication. But then at a level below that, basically palm off
right.
all the transactional responsibility onto other parties, and it seems to have worked for Andrews.
Yeah.
Like it,
What about
he's
the prime minister? So was his apology a bit more high level too, like that? Like I guess because it hasn't worked, I'm the prime minister. I'm ultimately responsible, or was it more like, oh, look, I'm really sorry we stuffed this up?
no, I think it was more high level. I think he's tried to keep it at that level, but yeah, we'll sort of see if he can sustain that narrative.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because at the same time, I suppose, yeah, you want people to apologize and acknowledge if have made a mistake, but if you do, then of course you can lose confidence in the mistake.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I remember Rudd not all that long before his downfall, and he sort of started apologizing for all kinds of things actually, which made him look weak. I think there was I'm struggling to remember now, but like some of the things around climate change policy and the reset there, because he had a narrative where he changed from one thing to the other, and there is a risk in it because it makes you look uncertain.
Yes.
It's a very fine balance.
Now, just to wrap up, we're going to discuss as well possibly some strategies that people could deploy in their own sort of lives and in terms of well-being. And I had a list of things which I use with a client, and I thought I could just cherry pick a few well-being strategies, and they're more for individuals, not for managers or leaders or people trying to embed, good well-being practices or anything like that. But they're more about individually, like what you can do to kind of give your well-being a bit of a boost, especially during lockdown. And they're all based on research. So I thought I'd pick a few and then see what you think about them. Tell me if
Okay.
you think they're practical or if they actually make sense to you. Or
Okay.
okay, so let me see. All right, so there is one strategy that is often recommended, and one of them, and it's about worrying about things. So, like, we have a tendency, all human beings have a tendency to worry, to ruminate, and to perhaps spend much too much time worrying about things that you can't control as well.
Yeah.
So, one of the strategies is that instead of allowing your mind to just worry whenever it feels like it, actually scheduling in time, say like a specific time in the week to actually sit down and worry for 15 minutes or something. In other words, you're not gonna avoid worrying. You're just gonna make time for it so that it doesn't interfere with you on all the other days.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this at all, to be honest with you. Like, I think, everybody probably has some proclivity to worry, but there's a great range within that. Like, I know some people who really don't worry at all, like my Labrador, for example, but also humans. I would actually be, if I was scheduling, say, 15 minutes on a Wednesday afternoon to worry, I think I'd be worrying all week in the lead up to that about that worrying session. Like, it's not something you look forward to. Like, I mean, I think on one level, it's good because there are steps you can take, maybe circuit breaker things to sort of get out of a worrying rut.
Mhm.
Like you can worry and you can sort of like do something positive, like have a conversation with somebody, go for a walk, do this, and it'll sort of like break up the worrying cycle. It's harder in lockdown and
Mhm.
it's harder depending on your circumstances in lockdown. So if you're like living alone and you don't like living alone, or you're living with people and normally you'd not be so housebound, and yeah, all those things are hard. So I think it's probably great in theory, a little bit difficult in practice.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the scheduling it in, but I think there's something to be said about saying to yourself, if you are worrying, that you can actually like just literally say to yourself, I know it's, yep, I know it's a problem, and I'll worry about that later. Like I'll this is
Yeah, I
sort of
actually that's a good yeah, that's a better way of putting it. I sort of do that sometimes, like particularly work things, I'll triage them. And
hmm
we've talked about this before with like, technology and communications and the way things are coming through all the time and the ability of saying that to me that's prioritizing. So it's almost like maybe you're still worrying to a degree, but you're not worrying about everything all at the same time.
Now the other, so this is a second one. So this one is related to attachment theory, which is you probably know a little bit about it from like it's I guess it's more related to like when you're kids or also to animal attachment as well. So when you're a child, you get a lot of security from your parents or your
Yeah.
caregivers, whoever they might be. So instinctively, our connections with other people where as we're adults become almost like surrogate attachment figures. So they're people that comfort us in the future as well. So like
Mm,
they could be partners or our children or still our parents as well or
mm,
our siblings.
mm,
So attachment figures become sort of symbolic. And so one of the strategies when you're under pressure or feeling stressed or worried about something is actually to reflect on a positive experience or reflect on your attachment figures, so your family or friends. So think about them,
mm.
and that's been shown to kind of reduce anxiety and stress as well.
Mm.
How do you feel
Yeah.
about that one?
I think that makes sense to me. Yeah. Does that mean like just reflect on them, or does it mean sort of go back to them and seek out support from them as well?
Mm. Well, that could be the case. You certainly could do that, but it's more under a stressful event where you feel like you need a cognitive strategy.
Yeah.
What are some of the ways you can manage that? And if you think about it, there's really only two things you can do. It's you can either do something physically, like with your body, or mentally. Right? They're your two strategies. So this is, I
Yeah.
guess, a mental strategy rather than a doing one.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I think so. And to me that kind of leads on to, you know, as you get older, hopefully there's wisdom, but there's certainly experience. So as you get older, you've dealt with stressful situations before.
yes.
And so I think you can kind of recognize them for what they are a lot of the time and know that they'll pass and know how you've got through them before and what's worked and what hasn't worked. And yeah, the concept of home, even thinking about it, what home might mean for you, whether it's, family in a sense of memories, your childhood home or your current home with your partner or what setup you have now, I think those things are a source of strength.
Now, this one is about values. So there is, and this is something, an activity that we often do, like at my work, in terms of like with in workshops and things.
Yeah.
But basically, any sort of strategy that gets you to really reflect on your values. So it could be something like you give people a list of values like safety, family, freedom, learning. There's lots you could come up with, and you
Mm,
get them to either rank them or at least reflect on the ones that are most important to you.
mm.
So, for example, if you were to ask people, what do you think is more important, your personal safety, your family, or your personal freedom, uh,
Ah,
and basically get them to at least prioritize, pick the one that you think trumps the other ones.
yeah.
Um, then basically that's related to a concept called self affirmation,
Yes.
and it's about reaffirming you as a person or what's valuable to you, and it has a way of kind of stabilizing us and making us feel a bit more secure, because we're kind of like, you look, there's all this stuff going on in my life, but ultimately these are my core, my foundations, and they're still solid, and it kind of makes you
Yeah.
feel more secure in yourself. So that's another strategy for I guess managing stress or managing difficulties when you're feeling a bit I guess disconnected or unhappy.
Yeah. And I think actually stressful situations can be affirming because they can be an opportunity for you to, they're challenges, right?
hmm
So they might test your values and the way you respond. And if you sort of come out of them in a way that maintains your kind of personal integrity, the way you if the way that you perceive yourself
hmm
lines up to how you actually behave in the situation, that can actually be a very affirming thing.
Yeah, interestingly, one of the recommendations is also identify something you would normally avoid and actually challenge yourself and actually do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
Yeah.
And now that's probably related a lot to so in psychology, there's like they talk about the two broad motivations: is avoidance and approach.
Mm.
And there's like an interesting article I read years ago, which I always remember, was like if you look at all like biological organisms have a tendency to move towards something positive and move away from negative things.
Yeah.
And they gave a an example of like I think it's a single celled organism will move towards like a bit of light,
Mm.
but will also move away from very harsh light, like too intense light.
Okay.
And so it's basically the argument was that yeah, but in the look in more sophisticated animals, that obviously anyone who's owned a dog, for example, knows that there's a really easy way to reinforce a dog could be give it a little treat when it does something right, but you can also
Yes.
chastise it and get angry with it when it does the wrong thing. And
Yes.
both strategies work quite well with dogs.
That's true. That's true. It depends a little bit on the dog, I think. But yeah, yeah, it's true.
Yeah, yeah. And so anyway, if you so one of the problems with, and this is what a lot of psychotherapists essentially do, is what they're really trying to get you to do is approach the things you would normally avoid, because the things that you
Yeah.
avoid are a source of anxiety and uncertainty, and there's a sense of like accomplishment and a feeling of also overcoming your fears when you actually do things that you don't like doing.
Yeah. This is a really interesting one because a lot of people talk about being comfortable in the danger zone or the, what do we call it? Getting out of your comfort zone. You'll hear people
Mm.
talk about how they thrive on that and that kind of thing. And I often wonder about that, like whether they really do or not, or whether they've correctly even identified what they're uncomfortable with,
Mm.
because there might be things like deeper down that they're really more uncomfortable with and they wouldn't really like going there. So
Yeah,
yeah.
true. Well, Simon Moss, who's been on our podcast a couple of times, I remember he said once that you look for those things that you would normally avoid doing, and actually do them, because if anything, that's the perfect excuse to do them if you don't want to do them, because they're the things that will probably make you feel better. So
Yeah. What? Sorry. He's saying you should have avoid the things that you don't want to do.
yeah,
Is that
it was almost like if you don't want to do them, then that's almost like the indicator that that's something you have to do, or that's something you should be doing.
oh, okay.
I think I've bastardized what he's told me now. I have to ask him again. But it
Yeah,
basically,
yeah. I mean, a part of me like thinks that by the time you get to be say 40, you kind of know yourself and what you like doing, what you don't like doing, and you also know some things that aren't good for you.
yes.
And there's great wisdom in that. So if you know that like you don't get along particularly well with like a distant uncle because he sort of just reminds you of like bad times, or he's not a then you don't go and hang out with him or something like that, or you don't do this or do that. Yeah.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think, yeah, you're right. You wouldn't go through your life just going looking for more unpleasant experiences all the time just for the sake of it, because you'd be miserable.
Yeah.
You know what I think it is? It's almost like if that thing is actually a necessary evil to get to a goal that you want to achieve, then
Yeah, well, no, that's a good point. Yeah, because someone I'm working with at the moment is a former Olympic athlete, Kyle Van der Kuip. I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning this, and he talks about thriving in that sort of discomfort zone in terms of his training. So
Mhm.
when he was a hurdler, but that's very much goal orientated. So he had to push himself really, really hard, physically and mentally and everything else to do well with the training, and obviously to win a medal and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think yeah, you're right, and there's a lot of people who would probably avoid doing things in their career because there's some aspect of it which they don't like. So it might be something like, they might go, look, I don't like public speaking, so I won't do anything that's going to expose me to having to speak
Yeah,
in
yeah,
public.
yeah,
Uh, and there could be like, I guess, oh, look, you know what's interesting? I knew a guy once who he hated flying, like
yeah.
just absolutely hated it. So I can imagine that having a job where you had to constantly go interstate would be like an ongoing stressor.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But
That's
the
true.
funny thing was he liked skydiving.
Seriously.
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of an odd thing, and he was like saying that there's something about the skydiving which is different because you feel like you're in control. You're taking the risk, but when you're sitting on the plane, allowing someone to fly you from A to B, that it's you.
Yeah, and it makes sense in a way because skydiving is the act of leaving the plane. So if you sort of like,
That's
I mean,
true.
I don't mind flying at all. I get a little uncomfortable on very small planes. Like I've spent some time in my travels, like going on smaller planes. I just don't like the bumping around. It's not even that I'm scared of the plane crashing or anything like that. But so I've actually got this sort of unfulfilled commitment with a good friend to go skydiving. Like we had it all lined up before COVID happened, and it just keeps getting delayed. And I've said to him, when the plane's up there, like he's a qualified pilot and flies light planes. When the plane gets up there, I'll be quite happy to jump out because by that point it's going to be sort of bumping around a little bit and I won't really be comfortable in it. I'd rather just sort of jump out of the plane. So it does make sense to me.
Yeah, I love that. That's what you said was it makes sense because skydiving is actually the act of leaving the plane, and that sounds like it's like lesson number one. Like it's like now the purpose of skydiving is it's actually leaving the plane. And it's just
Yeah,
in case you're unclear, in case you're unclear about it, and that's the basic concept.
if there's any sort of misapprehension. I was on a flight once years and years ago to the US. Across the Pacific with a woman like sitting next to me who was obviously scared of flying, and I didn't really notice until well into the flight, and we were sort of somewhere over Fiji or something, and she turned to me and she says, "I have to get off the plane." And I didn't really take it in at first, and I'm like, I think I said something like, "Oh, we've got about 6 hours to go,"
Yeah.
and she's like, "No, I have to get off the plane now." And she just stood up and started like in a very agitated way, walking up and down the aisle very quickly and just sort of saying to anybody who would listen to her that she had to get off the plane. And so, like, one of the flight attendants sort of came over and she was really good and spent some time talking to her. And I think they gave her a pretty large gin and tonic, and she sort of she calmed down
Couple of
somewhat. But
gin
it
and tonic.
was just that sort of thing of like you want to exit a situation, and the reality of
Mm.
it isn't sort of
Yes,
that
I think
apparent.
the fear of flying thing. I'm not afraid of flying, but occasionally I do sort of think to myself, oh, I get a bit uneasy just when, especially when it does that sort of drop with the turbulence, and you
Yeah,
feel
yeah,
like, well, this thing's is not as secure as you'd like. But I can understand it, right? Because it's not just the fact that you're in the air, but also you're contained as well. It's like a combination of claustrophobia and heights, and so it's a
yeah.
very unique thing, right? And I think yeah, it's probably one of the more rational fears in a way, isn't it?
It is, and there's a sort of sense that we're not really meant to be up there. Like, I mean, it's great that science has enabled us to be up there, but
Yes.
it's not a natural habitat for us.
No, no, and it's certainly like I don't have a fear of heights, but I will never jump out of a plane. That's for sure. I don't know how you can even contemplate doing it,
Yeah.
and I've got no interest in going into space either because
Oh, I do.
the idea of going up there and then looking down, it'd just be like, oh my god, just put me back on the
I,
earth.
I would love to do it. I got into this sort of not really argument, but disagreement with my mother once because I asked her if she had the chance to go to the moon or go to Paris, like which one would she do? And she said she'd go to Paris. And I said, you've already been to Paris. And she's like, just like that would be more interesting to me. But I would, if I was like Jeff Bezos or whatever and had the money, I would definitely go up into
You
space. In
would?
fact, I even have a bit of a hope that, I'm 41 now, that by the time I'm in my 60s or 70s, maybe if the price of space travel has actually fallen to something that's, remotely affordable, I might be able to do it. I would definitely be in for it. I don't think I'd be up for the one-way trip. I know some people talked about volunteering to go to Mars or something like that,
Yes,
knowing that they
yeah.
won't be able to come back, and that's incredible. But yeah, I'd definitely like to try it.
Yeah, I know someone who was expressing that they probably would like to do like that. There was I think there was a space trip which was basically you go off into a spacecraft and it just goes off into off into space and goes on forever, and then that's what they do. It's not with a destination in mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. You
Yeah.
age differently up there too, I think. Like, I mean, it's sort of fairly infinitesimal, but I think if you spend time in orbit, you age slightly differently to what you spend
Oh, really?
the Earth. Yeah.
or just because of gravity or something.
Something like I don't know, I have to look it up, but it's like I just wonder if someone spent years up there, whether it's sort of magnifying
I don't think
or
so. I don't
somehow
think
live for so
it's yeah, like
Oh,
a
I'm getting very sci-fi now, and I could see it as like the
mm.
premise of a movie or something.
Well, there's definitely something around, the speed of light. Like as you approach the speed of light, time works differently, which they played that sort of idea that if you were traveling, if you went off at light speed in one direction, then came back to Earth, it would be gone, and all the people would be gone, but you would be the same age.
Yeah, wow. Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And in Star Trek, they have a workaround with that because they're always zipping around, and they call it I think it's like some relativity bubble or something they've got on the ship, which basically
Oh, so they can do warp speed travel,
yeah
but then get back to wherever and it's okay.
yeah
Yeah. I was
so
actually thinking of Star Trek because I've seen some episodes and series where they have a generational ship. So they'll have a ship that's on such a long journey that it's had like say three generations of people, like a little society on like Star Trek Voyager is obviously set. They've got a very, very long journey, and theoretically, it's going to take them like 70 years or something to make the journey. And they meet fellow travelers who had to flee a home world that's exploded or something like that. And they don't necessarily know what their destination is. They're kind of like just traveling through space.
yes. Oh, that was yeah, unfulfilled potential, that show, because you're right. They could have what they planted the seeds at the start where they were going to have potentially children on the ship, and there was going to be generations, and they could have actually. I think if they made it today, they probably would have been a bit more ambitious because they could have done things like, let's say, season 3, we're going to skip ahead 20 years and see where they are, and
Yeah, they would do that now, I reckon.
mm,
They do a lot of, it would be a totally different show. They probably do like flashbacks and things. And it would be harder to follow.
yes.
It's quite
More,
linear,
more
really.
ambitious,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah, because yeah, the original. I think with that show, they kind of had a formula from the other TV shows, and they were like, well, we want to have like this sort of weekly show, and we want the story to be wrapped up at the end of it, and that's the way they did it. Whereas today, a lot of the television shows are not. They're almost like big movies that are cut up into sections rather than
Yeah.
like series.
It wouldn't have been such a sort of neat self-contained thing necessarily. It would, yeah, because it had an ending, like it had a a satisfactory ending in a lot of ways in terms of the narrative, but it tied it up in a bow. Did
Yeah.
you see that Picard series that was on
Oh yeah.
fairly recently? And they spun out like the Seven of Nine character into that, which
Yeah,
was
I hated it. I hated.
yeah. I actually got halfway into it and then
It was.
didn't hate it, but didn't love it. Like, obviously, didn't love it enough to go back. But I found the idea of revisiting characters interesting.
I
I
think
like,
yeah, that's become a big thing because they did with Star Wars as well, and I
yeah,
think it's unfortunate that it's been a disappointment on most occasions. All of these
this is the trouble.
yeah.
Yeah, sometimes they're better off leaving them alone.
Yeah, I found that show was I found it to be incomprehensible. Like the actual plot was just I watched the whole thing because I used to watch The Next Generation. I love Patrick Stewart,
Yeah,
and so I stuck through right to the end, and I still couldn't tell you what the show was actually about, and I just could not follow the plot, and
yeah, I had a similar experience. I liked his interpretation of the character and
hmm.
later life and all that stuff. And he's a masterful actor, but I had trouble with the storyline. Yeah,
Yeah, and the thing I couldn't get my head around with Star Trek was always a very hopeful show, and in the future it
true.
was always about at least the Federation, which is where it's set, is it's kind of gone beyond like money and personal belongings and things. It's more about personal development, and whereas that show it almost like was trying to bring it closer to modern problems where they had like what do you call it, the haves and the have nots, and Picard
Yeah,
on
yeah.
a nice vineyard and other people are suffering, and you're kind of going, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's right. Because Earth is in that reality is supposed to have moved past a lot of that stuff. I think, isn't it? Yeah,
It's supposed to be a utopia, basically.
yeah,
It's like
yeah. Which
the
is an interesting idea in itself, of course. Yeah.
yeah, well, very hard to show because it's hard to present it or how you could ever get to there and get rid of money and all of those
Well,
things.
utopia is kind of boring because all the problems have been solved. So
Yes.
there's like conflict is the essence of drama, right?
Yes, well, one thing's for sure is that right now, whilst we're better off than our ancestors probably were when they had the Spanish flu outbreak, because we've still got Netflix to see us through all of these, and the internet and central heating and all of these great things.
Yeah, yeah,
But we're certainly not in a utopia yet either.
true. Yeah.
Um, so in the meantime, we might just have to practice some of those little cognitive well-being strategies until we get to
Yes.
the future where there's no money and everything gets replicated at your fingertips.
Serenity now.
Right.